כדי לדבר על אפליה גזעית ועל למידת מכונה הוגנת, הזמנתי לרעיון עבודה את דוקטור צ'ארלס ארל. הרעיון התקיים באנגלית. I invited Dr. Charles Earl for this job interview episode to talk about racial discrimination at the workplace and fairness in machine learning.
רעיון עבודה. רעיונות מעשיים מפי מנהלים, חוקרים ומומחים בתחומם. עורך ומגיש חוקר הנתונים דוקטור בוריס גורליק. בואו נתחיל.
Dr. Charles Earl is a data scientist at Automattic, my previous place of work. Charles holds a Ph.D. degree in computer science, M.A. in education, M.Science in electrical engineering, and B.Science in mathematics. His career covered the position of assistant professor in DePaul University and a wide range of hands-on, managerial, and consulting roles in the field that we like to call today as data science. But there is another aspect. Dr. Earl has a brown skin. He was born to an African-American family in Atlanta, Georgia in the 1960s when the racial segregation was explicitly legal. I'm sure that this fact affected Charles's life, personal and professional, and we will talk about this today. Hello, Charles.
Hello, Boris.
So it was quite a long introduction. Is there anything that I missed or got wrong?
Absolutely perfect.
Okay, I'm glad. Thank you very much. So in this case, we are ready to start working. Okay, hello, Charles again. And so we are talking about racial discrimination, both in the workplace, and later we will talk about machine learning and racial discrimination or what we call fairness in machine learning. So, today we talk a lot about this racial situation, and there's a lot of criticism about it today, but it looks from my point of view that nobody today will admit of any type of racial discrimination today. But when you were a little kid, it was very much open and explicit, right?
It was the thing to understand about the South generally, and Atlanta in particular where I grew up, is that there had been more or less an agreement between the white power structure. They were mostly white people that were in control of government and industry, and a black community that they would put up with segregated laws, but that there would be a lot of concessions made, especially to what we would call the black middle class, in order for there not to be outright violence.
So you mind your own business, we might do our business, and we will coexist peacefully.
That's pretty much it. That it was understood that the black community would not get the access to the resources that the white community would. It was understood that there would be differences in pay, differences in access to resources, but almost at a level where you would essentially keep people quiet. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
When my mother went to school, she wanted to she was interested in teaching. So at the time, the graduate schools in education in the South did not allow black people to attend. So instead of allowing black people to attend, what they would do is, okay, if you could get into a school where there wasn't a place where there wasn't segregation, they would actually pay for your education there. So my mother got into Indiana University. The state of Georgia paid for her to go there. The math teacher I had in high school got into Columbia University Teachers College. The state of Georgia paid for her to go there because they didn't want her to attend University of Georgia.
And it was a completely legal, explicitly said and written, or was it like a silent agreement?
It was in law. At the time, there were also people challenging that law. And throughout I would say from the 1930s to the late 1960s, there was a constant legal challenge where a black organization, the NAACP might be familiar to your listeners. The NAACP would challenge a particular law. They might win it in the Supreme Court. Then the state of Georgia or the state of Mississippi, whatever the southern state was, would go back and amend the law so that there was a loophole that they could use to maintain a segregation. Maybe it didn't explicitly say black people can't ride on this bus, or black people can't vote, or whatever the segregation they wanted to maintain, but it made it so that it's unlikely that a black person could meet all the requirements for something.
Okay, so yeah, I think that we will talk about it a little bit later when we will touch the point of fairness. But it strikes me, I mean, since the biblical times, people were okay with owning other people, right? So slavery is mentioned in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible, in the Quran. But I mean, in the 20th century, it was the century of enlightenment, and still those policies were justified by so many people. And do you know what was the justification of this? I mean, nobody would say, okay, you have your skin color is too dark, that's why X, Y, and Z, right? So there was had to be some deep moral justification when people would think of things like this and justifying this to themselves. Do you know what this could be?
Well, it's quite long. I'll give you an example that the original settlers, I'll call them European settlers in the state of Georgia, had initially come and they had disavowed slavery, which was pervasive, at least in the British colonies. They came, they disavowed it, but they realized that the profits that they could make from indentured labor were so enormous that over the course of around 30 years, they repealed the anti-slavery laws and started, basically purchasing people from the state of South Carolina. So the initial thing was, one takeaway for all of this was profits kind of trumped morality.
There was in Germany after the Second World War, there was a saying that bread comes before morality. So they understood that, yes, there were so many people that did awful things during the war, but we have to eat something, so let's make them ministers or whatever. So what you say, bread and maybe some butter and some cream, just overcome morality.
Yeah. I mean, you had asked this question a long time ago when we were at a meetup. Why wasn't the system in the South set up to really exterminate black people? And it really boiled down to, if you look at the demographics of the South, in many cases, the largest, in many of the states, there was a larger black population than white population. So literally, the whole economy would have collapsed without free labor, essentially.
Right.
So, and and it was to the point where at some point the profits received from there's I think there's a better way to put it, but actually essentially forcing people who are enslaved to have babies and then selling the children was more profitable than actually the fruits of the labor they produce. So,
and we are talking about what? Which times?
This would be right before the Civil War. So 1830, 18 to 1860. Most of the people are making their profits by loaning
by
out
other
their
people.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, no, I mean it's hard to continue talking after. I mean, yeah. So, but you know what? You mentioned this college that your mother had to go to another state to take education, and there is another aspect in the American life that is pretty strange to anybody outside of it. Is what is now today called the historically black universities or colleges. Can you tell us a little bit about it? So it's just comes from the same time that people were not allowed to learn in certain institutions because the skin had the different color.
Yeah. So I think the first historically black college, again, was this idea of trying to find a way to educate people who had been enslaved, or people, even free black citizens who were not enslaved but couldn't go to the surrounding colleges. So there were a lot of I'll say religious organizations that were explicitly against slavery, among them the Quakers, and a lot of these organizations were basically funding high schools, elementary schools for black people. And I think it was around 1830 that one of them had actually funded a college.
Right.
After the formal end of slavery in 1860s, a lot of historically black colleges were founded, especially in the U.S. South, because again, the majority colleges, the state-funded colleges, would not accept black people. They were still trying to, still trying to end the freedom status of black people. So there were a lot of instances where northern philanthropists, among them the Rockefeller family, founded a lot of these schools, or at least gave huge donations to them. So a lot of the black militancy arose out of these schools. Because again, a lot of the intellectual activity was kind of confined to them. If you couldn't go to the University of Georgia, then you could go to Morehouse or Clark Atlanta University.
Yeah. So, but these universities and colleges are still today, like they have this term of historically black university. Is it a sign of pride, of heritage, or what does it mean today?
It does mean that. I mean, I think that to begin with, if you look, for example, at what schools are producing most of the black scientists and engineers. So I think about 10% of black people who go to colleges attend historically black colleges and universities. So
why is that? Is it cheaper, or is it just easier for people to relate to a community that is similar to them?
Yeah, it's well. So in other words, they're a relatively small fraction of
Mm-hmm.
the colleges that Black people attend. Only 10% of Black college-age people attend those colleges, but however, they're producing something like around 30% of the um, at least science and technology graduates. So they're relatively small in terms of attendance. A lot has to do with the price of the colleges. A lot of it has to do with just the availability. Okay,
Right.
not every large city has a historically Black college.
You know,
Okay,
I
but
took
they're producing kind of a
yeah
disproportionate share of
yeah. Okay, continue. Go on.
yeah yeah. And I think that's a lot to do with the attention and the um, kind of a dedication that they're putting into um, the Black students that attend. And
Yeah.
I think also this flows out of um, one of our issues of discussion, which is still that there's a lot of unacknowledged or implicit bias, you'll call it, in the society. I'll just call it that.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
um,
So you know what? Let's talk about bias. Um,
yeah.
there is a statistician psychologist called Gerd Gigerenzer who talks about fast and
Mm,
frugal heuristics, and Tversky and the Nobel Prize winner Kahneman, they talk about type 1 and type
hmm
2 thought systems, right? So, and basically
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
say that we as the human beings, we tend to make fast decisions based on the fastest available information, right?
Yeah.
So if I grew in a society where all people with dark skin work either as janitors or mechanics or gardeners, and then I see somebody in the CEO's chair and they happen to be Black, my
hmm
fast and
hmm
frugal psychology will trick me, and I will be super surprised, and I might even ask this person, "Are you here by mistake?" Because
Yeah.
you
Yeah. Yeah.
know that's the bias that I have. I mean, does it mean? First of all, you know what? Have you encountered this type of biases from people around you?
Yeah. I mean, uh, you. I would say that it. What should I say? I think that everybody has, falls back into those
Hmm.
kinds of, uh, expectations, even if, there are even communities in Atlanta that, because of segregation, are uh, all Black.
Okay.
And even if I see a white person walking, I'm like, okay, well, are they
Are you lost?
are they are they here? Uh, okay, the gentrifier has
So it
arrived.
happened to me.
So
I
that's a
once
bias.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
once had a trip in a very ultra orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem,
yeah,
and I obviously don't look like a very ultra orthodox Jewish person. And the person arrived to me and asked me whether I was lost, and he was very kind. Are you lost? Maybe I can help you because
yeah, yeah,
what else
yeah,
can you do
yeah.
here, right? And so I was a little bit amused, but I can see how somebody can be very offended if they are mixed up with a janitor while they are a C-level manager or an engineer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's um, what I would say is that in addition to those quick, value judgments
Hmm.
that we all make, there's also, you might have heard of the case of the birder in New York City.
No.
where there was a black cartoonist who
Mm-hmm.
who lived in New York, and his hobby is bird watching. And so the birders in New York City are very protective of places like Central Park. And if they see, somebody doing something, walking their dog in a area that could harm the birds or the park, what they usually do is give them a lecture about, okay, well, you're going to damage some species.
Okay.
And this gentleman was out doing his birding thing, and then there was a white woman walking a dog. She decided to take the dog over to some area where there's some species of protected bird, and he's like, well, please, please don't walk your dog here. And she, um, uh, you know, get, gets angry with him, and he says, "You're not behaving appropriately with your dog or the birds. Please leave the area." And then she proceeds to call the police, and she says, "I'm going to tell the police. I'm going to call the police, and they don't like black men, so you'd better
Wow.
be quiet." So it's that. So I think it's the area where it's again that line where it runs over into the. I think it's the presumption of policing, if I can put it that way. That okay, well, my bias might tell me that, okay, what are you doing here? But the person you walked into is just going to say politely, "Oh, I haven't seen you around. Are you lost? Kind of what's up?" Okay, nice exchange. When it gets into that point where the police gets called, or there are threats made, or
Or
the
somebody shot somebody,
presumption,
right?
right. You get shot.
It's an unpleasant.
Then we have to ask, well, okay, what gave you the sense that you could act as the militia? And I think, and it's still, there was a law in Georgia that gave people the right to do this. I don't know if it's still on the books, but there was a discussion recently about should the citizens arrest law go, and the citizens arrest law came out, again back in the 20s or 30s, implicitly to kind of give, essentially white militias the right to do that kind of thing. And my father gave me stories of these kind of citizens arrests happening. So it's a long-winded way of saying that yes, there's human prejudice, there's human bias. We all have it, but especially when you live in a society that's so um, where there's so many racial, religious, gender, identities occupying the same space.
Right.
How can we get
Sometimes in
beyond it?
parallel.
It's kind of an existential question.
Is it why you are? I think that you are an activist in the movement of Black scientists or something like that. I
Yeah,
saw
yeah,
you
yeah,
talk in a couple of conferences. Is it
yeah.
to increase the visibility so that this fast and frugal heuristic is less tricky?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that uh, there are two concerns that people raise in the technology space.
Mhm.
Um, One is, I guess, is the most important thing really is when we're depending on these platforms to make loan decisions, or when we're depending on a platform for our job searches. then, you know, whether the algorithm is being developed in Atlanta or is being developed in Hong Kong, it doesn't matter, but there has to be some accountability of
Right.
these platforms. And the other issue is, just the access that Black or Indigenous or the marginalized groups,
Right.
especially this particular organization kind of looks at Black people in Africa, Caribbean, U.S., Europe, but how are technology professionals able to have a decent career? How can they occupy these spaces and bring their perspectives and their insights into the development of the technology? So it's kind of fighting it from two ends, I think.
Do you see yourself, perceive yourself as an ambassador of this, so you called marginalized community, or is it just too big for a person?
Yeah, I think to me, it's just too big for a person. And I think also that, again, I come from from the perspective of somebody who existed in kind of in that segregated space. I went to a historically Black college and university. Even Georgia Tech that I went to was uh, when the time when I was a student there were certainly enough students, graduate students, and even faculty that were coming to the university, so that let's say I didn't feel excluded.
Okay.
It felt like a natural thing to be there.
Okay.
The city is mostly is heavily Black. The mayor at that time was Black. I had Black advisors, even at Georgia Tech, on some projects. So, in some sense, it was a very empowering experience. So, I think there were a lot of people in the 60s and 70s who were not only ambassadors, but kind of the rebels in the place who were, willing to say things and do things that were just kind of cracked open a lot of the discriminatory practices.
Well, it started even before that. There was the sociologist, I can't pronounce his name, W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce this name? Because I only read about him. Never, yeah. So for those who don't know, he was an African American who was a sociologist, and he acted in 1920s, and he produced a very interesting hand-drawn written atlas, data visualization atlas about the situation of Black Americans in the American South. You know what? I will
Yeah.
put a link to his works. It's just fascinating. And he was a leader, right? He was an
Yeah.
ambassador.
I mean, Dr. Yeah. I mean, and that's, well, I'll tell you some stories too that really rang out about Dr. In the South, they say Dr. Du Bois,
Okay.
but maybe it's Dubois. I don't know. So um, he grew up in a very, what at the time was a privileged family. He went to a historically Black college, Fisk University, did his doctorate at Harvard, I believe, and then came back to the Atlanta University Center to teach. And So he was an ambassador, as you say, into the elite, Harvard, but he was also kind of a rebel in Atlanta University itself. So I mentioned earlier on in our discussion that there was kind of this understanding between I'll call them the black elite and the white power structure in Atlanta, that
Right.
black people wouldn't make too many waves. Dr. Du Bois made a lot of waves to the point that he was finally fired from the Atlanta University Center. He was, basically targeted during the 1950s for being a communist sympathizer. His passport was taken, and so if you look at his archive, you'll see um, uh, Du Bois had visited Germany in the 30s when Hitler was on the rise. He gave some very just prescient critiques of what was going on in Germany, and kind of linking what was happening to black people in the U.S. to the plight of Jews in Germany. And you also see there are also pictures of Du Bois basically giving a lecture to Khrushchev.
Yeah, so it
So
was during the period when the Soviet Union
yeah,
was readily adopted the anti-racist
yeah,
uh, rebels in the United States to poke the United States policy, but I know because I grew up in the Soviet Union, it was a very racist place to grow up.
and he ended his life in Ghana, and I don't know if any of your the if you remember the March on Washington, Dr. King gave this famous speech,
Right.
and it happened just as Du Bois was passing away, and he was living in Ghana at the time, and King had just given his speech, and uh, a lot of people in Accra, uh, were both seeing the speech and dealing with the fact that Du Bois had passed away.
Right. By the way, I think that this episode will be published on Ghana's Independence Day, on 6th of March. Yeah, and the fact that I know this is just there is a marvelous song about Ghana and the Independence Day.
Yeah. So all that to say that Du Bois had a very had basically 90 years of productivity, and if there's any movement in the 20th century related to um, black independence, it's more likely than not that he had some involvement in it.
And it is very so. The only reason that I know about him is because I'm interested in data visualization and I stumbled upon his graphs. But his
Yeah,
role
yeah.
is mostly unnoticed.
One recent footnote to that is that they're now launching a data science consortium in the school that he used to teach, and as part of their introductory data science class for that um, program, they're encouraging students, or they're doing the project of looking back at a lot of Du Bois's visualizations and data.
Right.
So it's kind of a full story, full
Yeah. By
circle
the way,
story.
his graphs in more than like good practices terms are very good. So you can hardly guess that they were done like 100 years ago, if
Yeah.
you just ignore the fact that were all handwritten or hand drawn. So you know what? Let's talk about fairness in machine learning, because it's a huge topic that was surfaced maybe 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe for you it was relevant before that, but I think that you were one of the first people who exposed me to this idea. And so you know what? Maybe you will explain what fairness in machine learning means.
Yeah, so it's, I think, really about looking at what are the broader um, impacts of decision systems, of recommendation systems, and whether we can make these systems so that they don't cause harm to people, and that at least we understand how they arrived at the decisions or judgments or recommendations that they did. Since we rely on machine learning systems for job searches, we rely on them to shape our view of the world, to mitigate who we vote for and who we don't. Since these systems are kind of embedded in, at least in the US, is how people make decisions about who gets parole from prison, who gets incarcerated, who
Right.
gets locked up. So I guess I'll say that when I started my graduate career, even before that, my interest in machine learning and AI, it was kind of more of a laboratory thing. You know, expert systems were just kind of being used. People were tinkering with them to make even loan decisions. But now it's so pervasive that you don't have to think about a Terminator kind of scenario where the robot's coming to kill you, although you might
It's
well
pretty
think about
close.
that scenario. Yeah,
Yeah, it's pretty close.
it's
But even more
so
prosaic scenario, like loans, right? You
yeah,
cannot buy a house without getting a loan from a bank. And
yeah,
a bank has an algorithm that assesses your risk, and according to this, it will determine whether to give you a loan or not, and then what type of interest you will pay, right?
right,
So,
right.
and I talked to a data scientist in a company that does exactly this, risk ranking
Hmm.
for loans for banks, and she told me that one of the major criteria in the algorithm was the neighborhood of residence of the person. And as you know,
Uh-huh.
many
Uh-huh.
neighborhoods are voluntarily segregated. So because it was in Israel,
Yes.
if you live in a certain neighborhood, you are either a ultra orthodox Jewish or maybe an Arab. And then I told her that,
Hmm.
yeah, okay,
Hmm.
but your algorithm might do a good job, but you know that you are effectively discriminating people on racial or social criteria. And she said, yeah, well, I mean, she said, you know what, I'm here not to make social justice, but to make money for my company, for my employee. And if
Okay.
this is a correlation, and if this correlation, if this place of residence correlates to whether people will default the loan, so it will be. So is
Yeah, well, loans are an interesting area also. The thing I always keep going back to, and even have had this discussion um, at Automattic, the company I work for, about what are the trade-offs that you want to make in um, a decision that your algorithm makes. So is it important to, if your algorithm impacts people, is it worthwhile to deal with a certain amount of defaults in the case of a loan if you're going to allow people access to important resources? Is it worthwhile to tolerate a certain risk in loan defaults if you're able to open a housing market to people? If you know the impact might be that this neighborhood stays white and that Black people don't have access to the educational resources there, or that Arab people don't have would be
access to mortgages.
Would have access to education or healthcare or whatever it is that comes along with access to a neighborhood. Are you willing to make that call? What's the can you quantify the hit on profits? Maybe there are what is actually happening in the US now is that supposedly there's somebody who's been named in the new administration to I forget the exact title, but it amounts to a head of it's in the science policy directorate, I'll call it.
Okay.
And they're looking at what is the societal impact of these platform-based algorithms in Google and Facebook of access to jobs, healthcare, etc. So,
but you know what, I get what you mean, but you know what, maybe it's okay to demand from Google, Apple, or Facebook. They are very big and rich companies. Maybe it's okay to demand that they do those kinds of considerations. But if it's a small startup and they need every fraction of the percent for their revenues, is it still fair to demand that they do this kind of social responsibility considerations?
Well, I mean, I'll give the generic.
I mean, it's easy for me to live with them because I usually end up on the so-called the good side of most of the algorithms, except for the screening in airports when my Israeli passport might trick me outside of Israel. Right, in Israel it's the opposite. But I'm wondering what is the wider perspective of this.
Yeah,
When is the line between?
I think to me it's the issue of harm impact. So, if your startup is suggesting or designing fun memes for people, then okay, well, whatever.
But even then, there could be super embarrassing like fuck ups. I don't have another word. People marked as chimpanzees, or people faces are cut in the wrong places.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm thinking of what if your startup is, you're designing machine vision algorithms for a self-driving car.
Right.
Probably not recognizing someone who is dark skin, or somebody who is trying to cross the street in a motorized wheelchair is not acceptable, right?
Yeah.
That's not a societally acceptable risk.
So there is a
So
story, maybe you know better of it. I think it was Kodak, the photo film company, and all the scientists in this company were white. It was an American company, and it turned out that their film wasn't able to film African American people in a good way. They were too dark.
yeah,
And then they decided, they recognized it, and they marketed a special brand of film that was specifically targeted towards African American community. Do you know the story?
I don't know the detailed story.
Yeah, okay. So this is a nice story. Maybe I'm making it up, but the moral of the story is that once, at least for me, once you are aware of the possibility that there could be a bias, be it a photo film or a machine learning algorithm, you can address it, and B, you can also make money of it. Like if you specifically address the problem, right? So
Yeah,
maybe, I don't know, I'm just making these things up, but maybe it can be, you can see this fairness not as a burden, but as a marketing opportunity, maybe.
yeah, yeah. The history of the history of the economic success stories in marginalized groups in the U.S. has been that exactly. You discover that there's a um, you know, I'll talk about the Black community in the U.S. There's the particular aesthetics that we have, and they're not addressed by the larger hair, or I'll call it what's been called the beauty care industry.
Beauty care, right?
So people create their own brands,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the first Black millionaires earned and made it big because they focused on addressing that larger bias. They realized, okay, well, you're not going to um, examine it, so we are, and
Mm-hmm.
it created an opportunity. And there was a startup in Atlanta, I think used machine vision in some way to pick skincare products for women, Black women.
Right.
And I know they were Georgia Tech students. They sold their startup there.
So find a case of discrimination and make money of it in a good way.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a nice thing. Okay, so Charles, I mean, I could talk about it for more hours, but I promised my audience to keep the episodes under 45 minutes, and we are above this.
Oh, okay.
And I also have one, like we have in this podcast, a special corner that I call while standing on one foot or one leg. I don't know.
רגל אחת.
So the idea is this: you have to give me a short advice. It has to be a practical one, but it has to be very short, so that you can say it while you stand on one leg. You don't actually have to stand on one leg, but it has to be short and practical. What would it be?
Run 2 miles a day.
Okay.
I don't.
No, I forgot to mention. It would be a good thing if it's connected to what we were talking about.
Oh, okay. Always choose empathy.
Choose empathy,
Yeah.
which means what?
To always put yourself in the position of the other person, Okay, this is a little longer than standing on one foot, but if you when you encounter that person that seems out of place, the thought of asking them, do you belong here, probably pops into the mind first. But maybe the thinking slow about it, ask yourself, how would you try to visualize yourself in that person's place for a moment before taking it to the place.
It can go two directions. First direction is that wish well to everybody, right? That's what you just said. And the second aspect of empathy is that assume good intentions from everybody. So, well, I mean, when that person asked me whether I was lost, I didn't take it too hostile. I just told him, no, it's okay, because I said maybe he's just polite. Maybe he wanted me to get out of his neighborhood. I don't know.
Yeah. There's a thing in the U.S. South particularly that I've really grown to appreciate is the what's generically called Southern hospitality, but it really is just trying to kind of an ableist word would be to see somebody, but you just try to make a human connection, basically.
Right.
People around here usually say, how are you doing today? And I had never seen it outside of the South really until I went to I visited my wife's family in Africa, and people always expected you to greet them that way. If you started up a conversation without asking them how they are, and they would stop you right there and say, you haven't greeted me.
I think that it's a common thing for all the cultures who live in physically tough conditions, like in deserts or maybe. So the communication has much more context in it. So how are you?
Yeah.
How's your family? What do you say? Think about the weather. Yeah. Okay. So I noted be empathic and ask people how they are today.
Good enough.
Charles, I thank you very much for this conversation. I know that some parts of it were not funny, but we managed to make it. If somebody wants to contact you, how can they do this?
My email is good, charles.cearl@gmail.com.
Okay. You also have a blog.
Yeah. charlesearl.blog.
I urge you to follow this blog. You write seldomly, but very interestingly. So, right. I try not to miss any of your posts. I also like to thank my listeners. Those of you who understand Hebrew, please do subscribe. Most of the episodes are on Hebrew. And goodbye. Have a nice day.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
הרשמו להסקט בספוטיפיי, אפל מיוזיק, גוגל פודקאסט וכל פלטפורמת הסקטים אחרת. הצטרפו לדיון בפייסבוק בעמוד רעיון עבודה. עורך ומגיש דוקטור בוריס גורליק, חוקר נתונים ויועץ בתחום הדאטה. נשתמע בפרק הבא.